Welcome. Thanks for having me. So first off, my name is Chris Powers. I'm a contributor at DXdao. We are a DAO, a decentralized maximalist DAO who's fully on chain. We have a couple different DeFi products, and we also have our own governance product too. So today I want to talk about sovereignty in blockchains and DAOs, or the tagline, the evolution of the internet native sovereignty. So first off, what is sovereignty? Looking at our old trusty friend Wikipedia gives us this definition: the defining authority within an individual, consciousness, social construct, or territory. So the idea being, no matter what the entity is, what the kind of unit is, whatever power ultimately rests in, that's who has sovereignty in that world. Now, I imagine many of us maybe have been hearing a little bit more about sovereignty over the last couple months. Many people, when we're talking about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people are saying how it violates the sovereignty of Ukraine as an independent nation. So that's what we want to talk about today. Before we get to the blockchain stuff, I think it is important to talk a little bit about how sovereignty came to be and what we think about this concept. So there's kind of like two different traditions in thinking about sovereignty. The first comes more from like a religious or sacred tradition, right? So the ultimate authority in God kind of creates this level of sovereignty. That's a little bit different than the other one you can see up here, which is more like a political sovereignty, which I think we can take a lot more, we can learn from more in the blockchain land. So I don't know if anyone up here knows what this book cover is. If you look closely, you can see it on here. But it's a pretty famous book cover. It's the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. And so this really is seen as like the first instance of kind of talking about sovereignty as a country or a state that has this ultimate power. And in Hobbes' time, it was the king or the queen, right? The king or the queen had absolute authority over their kingdom or over their domain, right? And then starting with Hobbes and then moving forward, you hear like Locke and other philosophers of their time are kind of extending this idea of sovereignty away from just kings and queens and also to like representative democracies. But it all kind of goes back to this core idea that like the state is this source of power and is kind of independent there. And the other one, I guess we can kind of trace back to, if we look at the Peace of Westphalia, and I know we're like going over high school history here, but I think the Peace of Westphalia, and I'm not American, so the Europeans right now, I think it's like 1648 or something like that. But that's the first time that states recognized or respected the boundaries or borders of other states, right? So it's like, okay, like within these boundaries, you are sovereign. And then within these boundaries, like I am sovereign, and we're going to respect that. So I think that's really like where, especially the political tradition, is where sovereignty comes from. In blockchain land, I think there's two different elements we talk about sovereignty here. The first is censorship resistance, and then the second is self-sovereignty. So censorship resistance. I really think censorship resistance could just be rebranded to blockchain sovereignty, right? When we think about what does it mean to be censorship resistant, it means that this system, this network, is impervious or is protected against outside influence or coercion, right? And that's really the same thing as like sovereign, right? You have the power or the independence from other ones. So I think many would argue that Bitcoin and Ethereum have achieved some level of sovereignty, right? That is independent of what we traditionally associate with sovereignty, which is nation states, right? Ethereum and Bitcoin are in a lot of ways protected from an attack from one of the large nation states. And so that gives them an independence, which then others can build on top of. So self-sovereignty in sovereign blockchain, almost like a dream within a dream. So once you have an independent system that has like sovereignty and can create rules and people can operate in that, whether it's like political or economic relationships, that also opens up the opportunity for you to afford some individual sovereignty to the actors in that ecosystem. So I think when we think about blockchains, of course, there is a lot of self-sovereignty in blockchains. So of course, like the most famous being if you're on Bitcoin or Ethereum and you want to send funds to another address, as long as you have your private key and a fee, no one can stop you from executing that transaction, right? You are sovereign over your ability to send funds to any address on Bitcoin or Ethereum. And that kind of comes with the individual. I think there are some areas where maybe this is being threatened. I think like the most prominent one here is MEV, right? Minor extractable value. So the assumption is if you're operating with a self-sovereignty, that whatever you do, no one can within the ecosystem, within Ethereum, that you have the sovereign ability to execute something. Now, for minor extractable value, what is happening is it means the miners are actually trading against you. They're looking at what your transaction, and they are like they're not just executing that. They're actually kind of trading against it. So I think that really threatens the idea of self-sovereignty, as it also does when you think about the rise of like central custody, right? Because here, all the private keys, the more and more they go under like an individual custodian, the more centralized it gets there. So now we finally get to talk about DAOs and governance and kind of why we're all here. So DAOs enable collective sovereignty, right? So I think when we think about this self-sovereignty, that is really for just an individual address. Someone that has a private key, we can now afford that sovereignty to anyone with a private key. And I think DAOs are really the evolution, the next stage in that evolution, where it's not just the blockchain itself that is sovereign, right? It's not just an individual on the blockchain that is sovereign. It's like a collective or a group of users or individual that also have sovereignty. And I think this is something really new we're just starting to see. So to give a couple examples here, the DeFi lenders, I think we need a name for them. I'm kind of constantly referring to them, Maker, Compound, and Aave. They're these kind of big giants, but I do think they give us some good examples of on-chain governance and like kind of what is sovereign. So each of these projects, to determine like what are they sovereign over, especially when we get to DAOs, the question is, what is the core governance power, and how does that core governance power control the lending protocol, control the assets, or whatever, but the connection between the core governance power and the protocol itself. So for each of these projects, that's just the token holders, right? So for Maker, it's MKR, then Comp, and Aave. So those token holders are the core governance power, and so the question is, what are they sovereign over? So for Maker, MKR holders are like directly sovereign over the ability to change interest rates. Like they vote on chain, any MKR holder can do that, and that's kind of like all out in the open. For Compound and Aave, they have the ability to vote in new interest rate calculations, like the curves that basically calculate the interest rates for those lending protocols. Aave and Compound governance can vote those in. So the protocol, the token holders can be seen to actually have sovereignty over the lending protocols themselves. And then for all three of the projects, they have sovereignty over what collateral is added, right? So if you want to add an asset to Aave, Compound, or Maker, the only way you can do that is through token holders vote. And if the token holders vote to put a collateral on there, there's really nothing that can really stop them. And I think a key area where they're lacking sovereignty, and probably the weakest point for all of these, is of course the oracles. And I think it's like here we can kind of understand like the importance of understanding sovereignty and why it like highlights maybe some of the weaknesses here. Because token holders, MKR, Aave, Comp, they have no real say over the off-chain oracles. Like no one really, I mean, people do know what the oracles are, but there's no direct governance link to them. And of course, the whole lending protocol depends on being able to have a reliable price feed. So maybe there's a world where we can sometimes, if we move to on-chain oracles or something, where that can actually be linked up to the token governance. But right now, that's probably the biggest area where we're lacking here. There we go. Are we back? Yep. Maybe we can. Oh, we're back. We are back. And we're here to talk about Constitution DAO, so we can really explain what sovereignty is not. And maybe we should not be using the word DAO here. But I don't know, for those of you who are not familiar with Constitution DAO, they raised $40 million over 7 days in December to buy a copy of the Constitution. It has nothing to do with Nick Cage, but it feels like it should. So they actually were ultimately not successful in purchasing the Constitution. But again, I think it does highlight maybe some of the issues or shortcomings with their sovereignty approach. So if you donated or deposited money to the Constitution DAO smart contract, you received people tokens in return. So then the question is, like, what do people token holders actually have sovereignty over? And Like, the answer is not much. And I think it's, starts with, I think the third point, the obvious, like, the Constitution is not on the Ethereum blockchain. People token holders are. So then the question is, like, what is the way that people token holders' governance power is translated to holding the Constitution? And I think it really highlights, like, the two problems, the two challenges or problems with DAO sovereignty. So the first one is that voting is expensive. Voting on chain is expensive, right? So this whole idea of being able to, like, extend sovereignty from a single user with a private key to multiple users, all again, like, backed by that private key, that the action of aggregating, verifying those signatures in a public, decentralized way is actually really, really hard. Well, I mean, blockchains can do it, but it's just really, really expensive. So what this leads to often is people using off-chain voting and then relying on maybe like a trusted multi-sig signer to translate that, right? And you can see here, in that instance, it's not the token holders that have all of that sovereignty. It's really the multi-sig signers themselves that have that, who may take influence from the snapshot itself, but there's not actually like that kind of like direct link of sovereignty there. And then the second one is, right, with the Constitution DAO, it's real world custody, right? If you're trying to own or do something in the real world, at the end of the day, that means the DAO is going to rely on some type of legal entity or person. And when you're doing that, you're basically affording the sovereignty to whatever legal system that legal entity is, like, kind of managed in there. So, how are we doing on time? 8 minutes. So we've gone 12 minutes, and we haven't talked about any good sovereignty or also DXdao. So now we get to do both of these and give some good examples of how DAOs are exploring sovereignty. So I think DXdao, so as I said, DXdao, we have a bunch of contributors here. I think there's also a nail salon in there if you want to get some DXdao logos on there. But I think there's two kind of areas where we maybe distinguish ourselves from some of the other DAOs in terms of our sovereignty. So Treasury Sovereignty. So of course, with lots of DAOs, the Treasury is on-chain and is only unlocked or moved through an on-chain vote. But kind of on top of that, we've developed a system and really the infrastructure to be able to execute trades through the traditional governance process, through the proposal process, but still have it not rely on any individual or group of people. So to give the example, we have these relayer contracts that basically facilitate trades. And in those, in the relayer contract, you can set certain parameters that the trade should abide by. So one of the things we do all the time is we are purchasing DXD with ETH. And so just to walk through an example of that, you need to have one proposal that sends the ETH from the DXdao treasury to the relayer contract, right? Now this relayer contract is owned by DXdao. It can be upgraded by DXdao. It's the only one that can kind of manage that. But you send the ETH to the relayer contract, and then you have a second proposal that is basically programming the trade order that you want to put in there. Now, for anyone who's traded, or maybe not traded, clearly if you're broadcasting your trade like a week in advance, 5 days in advance, like that's a little risky, right? So how can you kind of put something in a proposal that is like, I want to trade X for Y on this certain date, when you don't know what that will be, right? So how can we utilize the transparency of the governance process and the time that and the benefit of going through that while also still maintaining DAO sovereignty? So the way that we did that is this relayer contract has two kind of checks on it. The first is it uses an on-chain oracle. So it uses the time-weighted average of whatever that price is at the time of the proposal execution. So in that proposal, when it's being submitted, say 7 days in advance, it can say, buy X token for Y at whatever price the oracle says at that time. And we do like a 2-minute twop, so it's a little bit harder to manipulate there. But that's the first way. And the second is we have like a minimum accepted parameter. So obviously, like oracles get manipulated all the And in that case, if someone did manipulate the oracle price, there would be kind of some ability for the DAO not to lose all its fund. So again, I think in that case, from submitting the proposal, the first one moving the funds, to all the way to executing the proposal, like the DAO is sovereign over that entire time. There's not any individual that actually needs to execute that. So with the relayer contract, it does require a couple calls. You have to call the oracle twice, and then you also have to call to actually place the trade. And to do that, anyone can do that. All you have to do is kind of execute the transactions and do that. So that's the first way I think we're kind of exploring DAO sovereignty. Oh, we did it again. The second way is over the front end. And I think the line I'm comfortable with saying here, I am pretty sure, I say this and no one stops me, so I'm going to keep saying it until someone does. I think DXdao is the only DAO that owns its front ends. I don't know of any other DAO, right? We think of any DeFi dApp that is used, right? Ultimately, those are run on AWS, and someone's like company actually owns that. But with DXdao, the DAO itself owns its front ends, and so this is DXdao, the website. This is all of our products, Swapper, Omen. All of these are actually owned by the DAO. And the key piece of infrastructure we use here is ENS. So just to kind of walk through this process here. So first and foremost, you have the DXdao contributors build a site and share it with the community. So again, this could be a product release. It could be a new website. But like typically it's posted on GitHub and it said, this is ready to be released. And then someone from the community will upload that to IPFS and then submit another proposal that redirects the ENS domain that is in the DXdao treasury. It redirects that to that specific IPFS hash. And that proposal goes through DXdao governance, through Ethereum on-chain governance. It costs a lot of money to pay the transactions to upload the website there. But all of that is going through the typical governance process there. And once that is executed, once it passes and the ENS domain name now resolves to this new IPFS hash, the only way you can take down that site is through another proposal through DXdao. And so we think about, again, censorship resistance and like sovereignty and seeing how we can like have these different workarounds really kind of to get in there. Where could DAO sovereignty go from here? These were like two ideas that I just, at some point I feel like I can explore and kind of really understand, but they're like maybe ones you need to do late at night, or Amsterdam's a good place to explore these. But yeah, collective consciousness. So I think when you have sovereignty, it ends up like translating to a new form of consciousness for whoever is like within that group, right? So even like society and culture are like kind of like different forms of consciousness. And I think when you have like DAOs is like a new form of how you can like have sovereignty, you're going to see like more interesting like formulations of that consciousness that I think we've too often seen in like societies, nation states, and religion. And so it'll be really excited, I think, to do that. And then property rights without violence, I think, is a really interesting idea. So, you know, at the end of the day, we think of like, what are property rights, right? If you own something in a country, if you own this building, like that means that if someone tries to take it from you, then the government will come in and remove them with force, right? Like you cannot have any property rights system without the threat of force, like underlying all of that. And even if you go into the self-custody component, right, where like everyone has, you know, you're self-sovereign as long as you have your private key. But like then it's like, okay, we got this private key. We've got to make sure we protect that. And that also kind of like relies on the threat of violence. But like with DAOs, if you can figure out how to have that ownership, not just be in a single like address, but like actually decentralized around there, you could figure out like this DAO owns this, and there's like no one being threatened with violence like to be able to do that. So I think it's like a really like interesting idea that I think like DAOs could kind of like pioneer with that. With that said, thank you. And yeah, I have 50 seconds maybe for questions, but in the meantime, please follow DXdao on Twitter. Keybase, we should maybe put our Discord in here too. It's a little bit more hopping. Keybase is like more, team discussion. As you can see, DXdao.eth, that's our website there. You can follow me on Twitter. I also write a newsletter, doseofdefi.com, if you're interested in kind of learning more. And so I don't know if there's any questions or I'll get welcomed off the stage. All right, perfect.